Mistakes in the history of science, not in science itself. Science is a method. We can use the word science to mean some different things. Science is a method. That's the fundamental thing, a method of thought. Two, it's the products. Science can be the products of the method. Or we can think about science as a community, like physicists, community of physicists or something. People can think of science as kind of that way, some practice of a group of people. But they are not always doing science, properly speaking, as such. The fundamental thing to learn in school and to learn about science is not the products or the thought of some authority, as is too often done. Fundamental thing we need to do is learn the method of science, the thought process. But it can go wrong, as we see in history, even like Galileo was wrong on some things, as everyone is on some things. But interesting, he thought in two new sciences. He divides this up into 4 days of presentation of material and discussion. First day, he's talking about materials, material strength, cohesion of materials. He's starting the science of starting material science. I'll put a link to this in show description. This is on, I think I can get this on Internet Archive for free. Yeah. I think there's some stuff there. Yeah. So I got it for something else. But interesting, because he says here, for example, so cohesion of materials, we know through the centuries in actually doing science, we found that material cohesion comes from electrical forces. But at this time, not much was known about electricity. Galileo, let's see, when did he live exactly? Galileo and Benjamin Franklin. We know Benjamin Franklin did some basic work on electricity, and that was after Galileo. But yeah, Galileo, 1564, 1642, and even the initial work of Franklin, before a lot more was done. Benjamin Franklin, died 1790. 1705, 1790. So, born about 1705, Galileo died 1642. So like over 60 years later, after Galileo, some even basic work on electricity was done, and then still wasn't understood to some extent. Modern bonding theory wasn't until the 1800s. Mid-1800s, early 1900s. More of it, modern stuff. But, so they didn't know much about electricity. Some work was still being done. It was basic, just rubbing glass rods and finding out about some static electricity. Some very basic stuff. So Galileo made the mistake of going beyond what he knew. Like he said that, where is it? Okay. Salviati says, the main character in this, he does this in terms of dialogues. 3 characters. Experiment leaves no doubt that the reason why 2 plates cannot be separated, except with violent effort, is that they are held together by the resistance of the vacuum, unquote. So by that, he means earlier he said here, quote, when he's asked about some materials, quote, first I shall speak of the vacuum, demonstrating by a definite experiment the quality and quantity of its force. If you take two highly polished and smooth plates of marble, metal, or glass, unquote, of course, not meaning a dinner plate, but kind of a flat surface, maybe rectangular. So, quote, if you take two highly polished and smooth plates of marble, metal, or glass and place them face to face, one will slide over the other with the greatest ease, showing conclusively that there is nothing of a viscous nature between them. Unquote. Viscous meaning viscosity, creating some resistance. Quote, but when you attempt to separate them and keep them at a constant distance apart, you find the plates exhibit such a repugnance to separation that the upper one will carry the lower one with it and keep it lifted indefinitely, even when the latter is big and heavy. This experiment shows the aversion of nature for empty space. And even during the brief moment when the outside air, when the brief moment required for the outside air to rush in and fill up the region between the two plates, even then, it is also observed that if two plates are not thoroughly polished, their contact is imperfect, so that when you attempt to separate them slowly, the only resistance offered is that of weight. If, however, the pull be sudden, then the lower plate rises, but quickly falls back, having followed the upper plate only for that very short interval of time required for the expansion of the small amount of air remaining between the plates, in consequence of their not fitting, and for the entrance of the surrounding air. So, that's the kind of plate thing he's talking about. Two smooth plates, placed face to face. Lift the top one up. Bottom one comes with it. And he makes up a device to measure that. That's part of the creativity and ingenuity of Galileo, being able to do things like that. Come up with a device to measure what he thinks is a vacuum. And to do that, there's a diagram. You can see it in the link I'll put in, but it's kind of like he gets a cylinder, and he's got something in it, and then that something that he's going to put in there has a hole in it, and he can put like a plug in there that you can push up. Then you could like pour water through it, but then when you turn it up, it's like a plug here that will come down like in a sink. So you got like a stopper here that comes down. Here you turn it over, it falls. There's room, and you can pour water in there. But then when you turn it over, the plug would be here, just like, as I say, a stopper or something in a sink. So then water couldn't get out. You can have it like this, pour some water in. Then when you turn it over, the plug would stop the water from getting out. And you got this thing in there. So, and then at the end on that, you can have a hook on that. Plug here, stopper, little hook. You can hang a bucket on there. And then you can put sand in there to see what it would take to pull this out of the cylinder. You can measure how much force, quote unquote force, the vacuum is able to withstand. So once you get that straw that broke the camel's back, that little extra amount of sand, the plug in here will come down, water will come out. If I'm interpreting that right, that's his device for doing that. Something like you got a plug in here that you can like fit in this thing. And then something, little hook coming down here with a bucket on it. When the bucket gets heavy enough, it'll pull this out. Until then, the force of the vacuum and the weight of the sand are counteracting each other. And then all of a sudden, this will be greater. So that's like the idea. And again, you can look at read it for yourself. But he does that, tests things, come up with some conclusions, compares it to a wire, thinking of like length and strength of a wire being measured similar to what he was doing here with the water in the device, because there was water in there, in the vacuum. But then the errant conclusion he draws, again, so, quote, again, experiment leaves no doubt that the reason why two plates cannot be separated except with violent effort is that they are held together by the resistance of the vacuum. So the vacuum is a thing that holds them. But that's known not to be the case today. And the same can be said of two large pieces of marble or bronze column. This being so, I do not see why the same cause may not explain the coherence of smaller parts, and indeed of the very smallest particles of these materials. So you got two pieces of marble, like you got the plates, and then you got two large pieces of marble or bronze column. Then he's going to smaller, like small particles. He's trying to reason from there. Now, since each effect must have one true and sufficient cause, so he thinks all this is like the same kind of thing. Because this idea is right, but different effect. Each effect must have one true and sufficient cause, and since I find no other cement, am I not justified in trying to discover whether the vacuum is not a sufficient cause? Unquote. So the mistake, he didn't know about what was really going on with vacuum. Some of that was discovered, I think, a little later with the great hemisphere experiment done by the guy who really figured out how to do a vacuum. Forgot where that was, but famous thing. I'll try to put a link to it. You got two spheres, maybe bronze, held together, and air pumped out, and horses couldn't pull them apart. And Galileo thought that was a force, but of course it's known that what's going on is atmospheric pressure is pushing on it and holding the thing together. It's not like vacuum suction as a force, it's atmospheric pressure pushing the things together that the horses are having to pull apart. And so at Galileo's time, they didn't understand the atmosphere or pressure. Some of that came with Pascal, seeing about going up a mountain and seeing how the barometric pressure changed, things like that, learning that the atmosphere pushes down on us as a fluid. So these things Galileo didn't have. So he made the errant conclusion, instead of saying, I do not know, as he knew to do, instead of figuring out that there's more things, he made this conclusion. Unfortunate, but they, as I say, they didn't know much about electricity at the time or what it was doing for materials. And then he says, over here, quote, in a reply to the question raised by Simplicio, one might say that although each particular vacuum is exceedingly minute and therefore easily overcome, yet their number is so extraordinarily great that their combined resistance is, so to speak, multiplied almost without limit. The nature and amount of force which results from adding together an immense number of small forces is clearly illustrated by the fact that a weight of 1 million pounds, suspended by great cables, is overcome and lifted when the south wind carries innumerable atoms of water suspended in thin mist, which moving through the air penetrate between the fibers of the tense ropes in spite of the tremendous force of the hanging weight. When these particles enter the narrow pores, they swell the rope, thereby shorten them, and perforce lift the heavy mass. And to go on more about the having a finite extent to discover an infinite number of vacua. He's discussing, you can look for yourself, some mathematics of this. Polygons, circles, gone into lines. But, and another thing he says about the many small things and a big thing. Another character, though, Segredo, if I remember the name right, quote, "There can be no doubt that any resistance, so long as it is not infinite, may be overcome by a multitude of minute forces. Thus, a vast number of ants might carry ashore a ship laden with grain. And since experience shows us daily that one ant can easily carry one grain, it is clear that the number of grains in the ship is not infinite, but falls below a certain limit. If you take another 4 or 6 times as great, and if you set to work a corresponding number of ants, they will carry the grain ashore in the boat also. It is true that this will call for a prodigious number of ants, but in my opinion, this is precisely the case with the vacua, which bind together the least particles of a metal." Unquote. So, there is the reasoning of Galileo, which is interesting in itself, and shows some thinking ideas in math precursor to calculus. Some of the ideas, small infinite amount, small forces can carry a big weight. They can add it to something big, a bunch of small things, things like that. So that's something we've got to be on the alert for. I don't care if someone's in the scientific community or is appellated a scientist. What matters is method. We got to assess method. If they're forming good concepts, inducing properly, taking everything into account to form a valid conclusion, not just speculating so much. Galileo would have needed to actually experiment on small things to see if this was the case. And he would have had to understand vacuum more. Instead of thinking it was a force, he was misled by that. He had a false concept, and that made like a red light for his generalizations and conclusions and thinkings. It was a dead end. But he tried to go forward. It was a fail from there. A vacuum is not a force. Once he got the idea straight, they could see that. And we need to consider sometimes other things that we do not know. So let's work on not just accepting something as true or as science because someone claims it because it's from the scientific community. We got to learn to assess the evidence and assess the argumentation and look at the big picture for what may or may not be coming into play. Is in the case here, but if you see what vacuum really is, if it's actually doing this, if it works on a small level, consider other things that could be holding matter together. We'd have to, just sometimes you're not going to know in a lifetime. He would have had to experiment with electricity, and it would have been known to really figure this out. But food for thought. Peace.